And now we come to hair. Hair is, in its most basic form, fairly simple, but can take a little bit of work to get to something that's believable. But over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes or so, I will try to get you to a place of decent understanding. So, first, before I worry about actually shading the hair, let's talk about just how hair works. And to do that, I'm going to go to a layer that has nothing on it. And I will just add in a temporary sphere. All right. So to just get any hair at all, hair is done through particles, and that's these four little stars, this icon right here. So you go there with your object selected and click on New. And by default, the type is an emitter. So if I hit Alt-A now, you can see that it is emitting little particles. But if I change that to hair, now we have hair. And this is the default hair system. Obviously, we have some work to do to get this to actually look nice. But if I turn on a layer with lights and render this, you can see what the hair renders like by default. Okay, so let's make this a little bit closer to realistic. I'll turn off this layer. All right, so let's look at our values. We have a seed value, which again is just kind of a variation. It doesn't change any of the other parameters. It just kind of offers a variation on the same thing. We have a regrow checkbox, which is regrow hair for each frame. We have an advanced checkbox, which will give us even more options, which we're not really going to worry about. But if you check that, then you can choose if you want to emit from vertices, faces, or a volume, and some other things there. Emission, this is an important one. Number, so the number of strands that it's going to emit right now, by default, it's 1,000. And hair length, which is pretty self-explanatory, and by default is 4 blender units. Then you also have use modifiers stacked, which will emit particles from a mesh with modifiers applied. We're not going to check that. Okay, so let's change the emission down to 100 for now, just for sake of ease of viewport manipulation. And then hair length will turn down to 1. Okay. So we've got some hair. We have hair dynamics, which you can turn on and adjust if you want to use cloth simulation for the hair. I can only imagine how processor heavy that can get. So if you do turn that checkbox on, just give yourself enough time to actually let the computer calculate it. We've got a render tab, so we have a default material. If I go to my material options and add a new material, and we will call this hair, then I can jump over to my particles, and now I have that in my material slot. So that's how you assign materials. I have an option to render the emitter or not. For our purposes, when we get to actually doing real hair, we probably aren't going to render the emitter. But you can choose whether or not to render that. Parents and other things. We have type of render, so render none. Render path, which is the strand, which is what we're going to be using. You can render an object. So you can render, let's say I set the object to be, let's see, what's going to be, we'll go a little creepy with eyes. Oh, and it's going to very heavily slow down because the eyes are fairly dense. Let's go with maybe boots, something that's going to show up. There we go. So now, instead of strands of hair, it's rendering a pair of boots. And because we've got the number of emissions set to 100, it's rendering 100 tiny pairs of boots around this mesh. Maybe not the most practical of applications, but you could use this for, flowers in a field of grass, or I don't know what else, but I'm sure you'll think of something. Likewise, you can also choose group, and this will render an object from a group. So you say group 3 different types of flowers or 3 variations of flowers into one group. Then you choose the flower group, and it will randomly choose one of those 3 types to populate at each point that it renders. So pretty powerful thing, but we're not going to be using it for hair at this point. I'm going to put that back to path. Strand render and adaptive render are for rendering in the Blender internal engine, so that's not really relevant for us. B-spline is for cycles, and I don't know exactly what it does, and I haven't checked the wiki, but for now we can check that. I'm sure it makes it better. Display. So you can, again, choose to display none, rendered, or just the path. We'll keep that unrendered, and otherwise just minimize that pane. We have children. So children are, for every strand, you can have a certain number of children. If I turn that to simple, we've got a display value and a render value. So it's going to display 10 children for every initial strand, but it's going to render 100 children for every strand. And then you can adjust the size of the children, the random seed. We've got clump. So if I turn clump up to 1, you can see that it clumps the tips together. If I turn it to -1, it clumps the base together, and they kind of fan out from there. And then if I turn clump back up to 1, we have a shape value. So if I turn the shape down all the way down to 0, it you can see how that affects the shape, and then I turn that all the way up to 1, or just shy of 1. You can see how that affects it there. So we've also got a child particle length value and a number of other values. We also have some additional kind of attributes that we can turn on and off. So we can make the hair curly this way, kind of radial, which I'm not sure exactly how that affects it because this isn't dense enough to tell. I'll make it kind of wavy, and you can also make it braided without having to manually braid it. And each one has its own attributes. Field weights, much like the cloth, you can affect, or you can determine how much gravity affects the hair and wind and things like that. Force field settings, I have not worked with, and we're not going to work with here, so we'll ignore that. And then vertex groups, which is a rather important one, which we will be getting to very shortly. You can use vertex groups and weight painting to determine where hair grows with density, the length of the hair, how much it clumps, any kink values, and anything else with that. And you can also assign textures and do additional things down here. We've got Cycles hair rendering settings and Cycles hair settings. One thing that we'll probably be adjusting is the thickness from the root to the tip. In my testing, it was all a bit too high, so we will adjust it that way. Also, now that I notice it, or this is probably a good time to bring it up. Now, I mentioned that we're probably going to have a not render the emitter object. So you might be thinking, well, hair is emitted from the scalp, and we have a scalp rendered, so why wouldn't we render that? That's because if you look at the base of the strands, they don't actually meet the emitter. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate part of our head mesh and scale it down so it's below the surface of the head, and then we will emit the particles from that so that we don't have a gap between where the hair starts and the scalp. Also with the children, I showed you simple. So simple will spawn the children kind of around the base of the parent strand. Interpolated will spread it out evenly between adjoining or adjacent parent particles. And interpolated would be really good if you're doing fur, so where you need a nice even spread of particles. So that's a kind of the basic overview of how to set this up. The other thing that I would note is the segments. So the segments is like the number of subdivisions of strands. The higher that is, then the more kind of intricate or complicated shapes and smoother bends you can get with the individual strands of hair. Okay, so that's the overview of how all of this works. Let's actually make some hair. So I'm going to go to layer 1, and here is my torso as it currently stands, and we're going to do hair. Actually on top of the head. You can also use this obviously for beards and for eyebrows and for eyelashes, but we'll start with the scalp. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to make my emitter mesh, and the way that I'm going to do that is going to side view and wireframe and circle select the scalp where I want the hair to grow from. Alright, so we'll say like that, and we'll come in here, and we'll kind of bring it down a little bit for sideburns too, why not? Alright, so I've got that selected. Now I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate it, and then P to separate by selection. Tab into object mode, and then select my new mesh. I'm going to rename it hair underscore emitter. Okay. And then I'm going to, just for now, I'm going to move it to layer 5, just so it's an empty layer and I can just focus on that for now. Okay. So I've got my emitter. Let's add in a hair system. Add particles, change the type to hair. I'm going to rename this. We'll call this hair because I'm creative. Type is hair. Segments I will leave at 5. Mission, I'm going to turn this down to, let's try, I don't know, 200 for now. Also, while I think about it, I'm going to save my file. All right, I'm going to change my hair length because that is ridiculous. So for now, I'm going to go with 0.5. Nope, that's still way too long. 0.2. How about 0.05? Yeah, that'll work for now. All right, so hair length of 0.05. Render, we need to give it a new material. So I don't need the skin material for the scalp. So I can X that out, add in a new material, and we will call this, again, hair. So that will work. And then let's set up a really preliminary shader node. We're not gonna do anything that's a finished product yet, but we do want to get something so we can actually accurately evaluate the hair as we create it. So I'm going to delete the diffuse node and hit Shift A, add shader and hair. Okay, and I will connect that to my material output. If I expand my preview here on the side and click on these 3 lines, that's actually a hair preview. So you can kind of see what that looks like. And let's look at the hair shader node real quick. We've got a drop down, which is, we can choose between reflection and transmission. So reflection is the light bouncing off of it, and transmission is the light going through it. We have a color option. We have an offset, which is an offset for kind of the angle of reflection. Then we have roughness values, similar to a glossy shader node. Now, by default, you can only choose one of these, but we actually want, hair has both values. Hair has reflection and hair has transmission. So we're going to duplicate this node. Oops. Move that down a little bit. We're going to duplicate the node and turn the other one to transmission. and then add in a mix shader. So now we have transmission and reflection happening in our hair. And then for now, let's set the color to, I don't know, maybe an orangish brown or so. Actually, I'll just copy this. Okay. So that's a very, very simple hair shader, which we will elaborate on in a bit. But now, let's get back to setting our hair particle properties. If we go to the render panel, we've got our hair material already set. I'm going to uncheck render emitter. And we want path, and we'll check B-spline, and that will be it for that panel. So I'll collapse that. Children, this is an important one. We're going to do, so I'm going to start with simple, and you're going to see this behavior, and it's really weird and kind of off-putting, and it took me a while to figure out what this is. What this is, or why this is happening, is the radius value for the child particles is set too high. So you can see if the tooltip here is radius of children around parent. So the radius is 0.2. If I set that down to like 0.02, you can see now the hair children are much closer to the parent and something that's certainly more manageable to work with. Okay. You could also set it to interpolated if you so choose. I think I will. Yeah, I think I'll leave it on interpolated. I kind of like the little bit smoother distribution of strands. Okay. So we'll leave it there for now. I'm not going to worry about any of the kink settings. So now let's talk about the vertex groups. Actually, one more thing before we do that. If I hit Shift-Z and render and turn on a layer with lights, you're going to notice that the strands are super thick and kind of cone-like and ridiculous, and that's wrong. So it's this thickness value, so I'm going to set the thickness value down to like, let's try 0.04 maybe. And the tip I'm going to also set to like, we'll do 0.04. There, that's a much better value for hair, and we can change that again later if we need to. But that's, now it's not a cone on your head, it's actual strands. All right. And let me turn off my lights layer. All right, now let's talk about vertex groups. So the way we're going to determine where the hair grows is with a density vertex group. And I think the best way to explain this is actually just to show you how that works. All right, so to set up our vertex group, we're going to go to the object data panel, which is these three dots in a triangle, and click plus to add a vertex group. And I'm going to call this vertex group hair _ density. Okay. Now, to actually adjust the density, there are two ways that you can do this. If you tab into edit mode, you can select all the vertices, set the weight to 1, and click assign. Now everything is assigned to this vertex group with a value of 1. Now, if I go into weight paint mode, you can see that everything is red. Okay, so everything is fully assigned to the vertex group. All right, so you can see everything is red. Now if I hit T to bring up my toolbar on the side, you can see some weight painting options. I've got brushes I can add, I can subtract, I can blur, I can do all sorts of things. And then various brush options here. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to turn on my subtract brush, set the strength to 1, and I'm going to subtract the lower half of the head. Okay. Now, if I go back over to my hair settings and go to vertex groups, I can actually choose under the density one, choose my hair underscore density. And when that happens, now you can see the effect, rather obviously what happens. Okay, where it's red, there's hair. Where it's blue, there is no hair. And then where it's anything in between, we'll have varying amounts of hair. This will not affect the length of the hair, just the density, just, you know, how many are in a specific location. So if I go back in weight paint mode, go back to add, set the strength to like 0.4, and start adding, you can see that there's hair growing out of the green, but not as much as there is growing out of the red. All right. So if you take enough time here, you can say, all right, we've got a bunch of hair that's obviously, this part of the head is going to be pretty thick with hair. But as we get closer to the base of the neck, maybe we want to subtract a little bit there. Same with the sideburns. Now, right now, I do also have, if I go to my options tab, I do have X mirror on, so I'm only have to actually paint half of this. It's a good thing to keep in mind. And then I'm going to paint this so that I don't want any hard edges where the hair just suddenly starts. I don't want it to look like a, you know, if you're driving down a road through a forest, there's that really hard line between where the trees are and where the road is. I don't want that look for the hair. I want a little bit more of a kind of gradual easing into it. So I'm going to kind of paint accordingly. Turn the radius down a little bit. Take some of the density away from the edge of the ear. Same thing with the top of the head. Okay. Incidentally, if you wanted to have somebody who was balding, this is a great way to start getting that effect, is you could just then take your brush, make it larger. By the way, to adjust your brush size on the fly like this, I'm just hitting F, and then you can click and drag out the size of your brush. But if you wanted to make them balding, then just kind of drag this over the center of the head, and now they're balding. Okay. You can also use the blur brush to kind of blur some of the transitions. Make it a little bit smaller. Okay. And so through this process, you can get a nice kind of gradual transition between the areas. And once you're happy, you can jump out of weight paint mode and go back into object mode. And that's the density vertex group. Okay, we can check this if we turn on again a layer with lights and go into rendered view. I'm actually going to, just for now, turn on the emitter render, which looks a little bit crazy. Actually, I'm going to turn off the emitter render, and I'm just going to turn on my layer with my scalp. It's going to look really funny right now, but we'll get there. Okay, so now that I have a density, the next one that I want to worry about is length, because most people's haircuts, excluding mine really, have varying lengths depending on where in the head it is. You know, oftentimes the top of the head or the back of the head is a little bit longer than at the base of the neck or the sides. So that's what I want to reflect now. So I'm going to just go into local view on my scalp, go back into my object data panel, and add a new vertex group. And I will call this one hair underscore length. And this one, I'm going to go straight into weight paint mode, and I'm going to apply all of the weights with the brush. So go to my add brush, and I'm going to work with the strength of maybe about 0.3. And I will start painting the scalp. All right, so the first layer, we will go probably pretty much all of it is going to get this length. Oops. Okay. All right, so I'm going to continue painting. Okay, so I want the top of the head and the back to have the most. Actually, I'll turn the strength up to 1 for this because I know I want this area to be 100% on the length. All right, so I'll keep that all 100%. Turn the strength back down. That might be a little bit too much. And I want to subtract this bit. Okay, keep the bottom a little bit shorter. All right, so we'll pretend that this is what I want. Not quite, but for the sake of time, we'll go with this. Okay. So now I can jump out of weight paint mode and go back to my particle settings and my vertex groups, set the length to hair_length, and you can see how it was adjusted. And now we can actually look at it again and make any more changes. So go back into weight paint mode. Control tab, by the way, will jump you from object mode into weight paint mode. But I got my subtract brush, make that a little bit larger. And kind of remove some of that. Maybe a little bit of that. Oops. Let's turn the strength down a little bit. Something like that, maybe. Ish. Okay. So that's the length more or less sorted out. Let's look at child particles. So I'm going to set the display to 100 so I can get a really good sense of what they're going to be doing. And then I'm going to set my render to 500 because I can. All right. So now let's look at kind of some of our effects. We have our clump value. And generally hair will clump together a little bit. You've got your shape value, so you can kind of experiment with that to get the look that you're going for. You've got a length value. I've got a parting value, which I'm not exactly sure how that functions. You can adjust the roughness of the hair. If you go too far, you get really weird things. But if you don't want the particles to look also similar, you can adjust that a little bit. You can adjust the endpoint rough, the shape of it. Let's see, adjust the randomness of the rough, and it just kind of makes it feel a little bit more natural. And I think I'll go with that for now. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do, or maybe not the last, but the next thing that I want to do is actually start grooming the hair. Because right now, by default, it's just growing straight out in whichever direction the face is pointing. So, one note, when we jump into particle edit mode, that's going to lock our emission number, our hair length, the segments, the seed, and then the name of the settings. So just be sure you got those settings where you want them before you jump into particle edit mode. If after you jump into particle edit mode you want to change any of these, you have to let's see, where's the button? You basically have to get rid of all of your changes. And there should actually be a, there it is. Once you start making changes, you can free the edit. You'll lose the changes, but then you can actually adjust these settings if you need to. Now, in particle edit mode, we have many options. We've got some brushes, which takes on a little bit of a new meaning when you're dealing with hair. We have comb, which will comb the hair. I think that's pretty straightforward. Smooth. Add, so you can actually add more particles in this mode if you want to. That also means that you can adjust the count. So if you want to add 19 particles at a time, you can. Or if you just want to add one at a time and actually very meticulously and deliberately lay out where your hair is, you can do that. So for the best results, that's kind of the way to go. There's not really a shortcut for that. But you can manually lay out strands of hair, which would be useful for doing eyelashes and things like that. You can adjust the length, so you can grow the hair or shorten it. Puff. So let's say you comb the hair down really close to the head, and you don't want it to be laying super flat, then you can use the puff brush and kind of bring it back out a little bit. Cut. If the hair is too long and you want to cut it, and that's, the behaviors are pretty self-explanatory. And weight, I'm not entirely, you can weight paint the hair particles. I'm not sure what use this has, but I'm sure it's got a great one. We will not be dealing with that. So we'll start with comb. You also have an option down here to draw the children. So if you want to see how this is going to look like with the child particles, you can check that box. It's good to kind of work back and forth and just see how what you're doing is affecting the hair. So for combing, I'm just kind of slowly rotate around the head and get the hair starting to go in the direction that I want it to go. Kind of like that. I'm just going to do a really kind of traditional classic part for now. Nothing particularly daring or inventive. Okay, and then for this top hair, I'm going to kind of comb it over a little bit. Okay. Now, I don't want the hair laying super flat against the head because that's weird. So I'm going to turn on, oops, not children. I'm going to go to my puff brush. I'm going to turn the strength down a little bit and slowly start kind of bringing it out from the head a little bit. Okay. Now I can turn on children and see how that's looking. Let's turn up the number of segments and maybe puff this out a little bit more. Okay, if I feel like I need it, I can add a strand of hair or two wherever I want them, and then I can just recomb them like that. Maybe comb just the tips down a little bit, like that. Okay. Oops. Then jump back into object mode and, okay, so there's a very basic and quick groom method for the hair. Now, I can't change the number, the emission, and the length, but I can still adjust how the children behave. I can still adjust the clump if I want to. I can still adjust the number of children displayed, things like that. So I'm not completely screwed by editing the particles, but it is something that you want to make sure you have at least the general settings taken care of before you start combing the hair. All right, so if we assume that this is where we want the hair to be, which is a bit of an assumption, but we'll go with it, I'm going to get out of local view. Oh, and there's one thing that I did forget to do, and that is I'm going to tab into edit mode on my emitter object, my scalp, and I'm going to hit Alt-S, and I'm just going to scale it down just a little bit so it's underneath the surface of my hair. And that's, again, so that the root of the hair actually looks like it's going into the scalp and isn't floating above it. So I'll just Alt-S a little bit, and we should be good there. Oops, I may have gone a little too far, though. Give me a second. That's interesting. Okay. All right, so now that I'm seeing my actual head again, I'm going to make a couple of quick adjustments. Primarily, I'm just going to go down to my child properties, and bring the length back up a little bit. And go back into particle edit mode. And use the puff brush and just try to bring that out a little bit more. Just do a little bit more editing. Okay. Maybe add a couple more hairs here and there, so I don't have any super obvious bald spots on my head. Okay. So again, assuming that this is close to what I want. Oh, we've got some other random kind of hairs that are happening all over the place. I'm going to actually cut this hair right here. Actually, turn off X-axis mirror for the hair because I don't want that to be the same on both sides. That's a good distinction to have. All right. All right, so yeah, done with particle edit mode. Go back into object mode. And I will bring this down, and let's start talking about shaders. So if I hit Shift Z, and you can start kind of rendering the stuff. Oh, that doesn't look great at all. That looks like I may have some issues. I'm going to turn my children display up to, let's try 200. 300. This computer can handle it, right? Okay. So there is, now what the strands are looking like. They still seem a little bit thick, so I'm going to go down to my Cycles hair settings and change it to, let's have it to 0.02 each time. That looks a little bit better. But our length is still really weird, so I think the scalp scale needs to be adjusted. A quick note is if you are in particle edit mode and you hit Shift Z to try to see a previewed render, the hair will not render, so you just have to get out of particle edit mode, go into object mode, and then the hair will be there. All right, so that's a little bit better, a little less patchy. God, this looks really weird because I've never had hair, so this is a little bit of a trippy thing for me. All right, so let's actually start looking at our shader. And I'm going to turn my children display back down to 100 so that I can actually do any amount of work. And now it looks patchy again. We'll just ignore that patchiness. All right, so we have a reflection and a transmission. You can see the kind of the angle of the reflection is kind of going across here. So if I adjust the offset, you can see that the reflection kind of moves. I'm going to keep that at 0 because that's fine. The roughness, like a glossy roughness, is kind of the sharpness of the actual highlight. So lower is sharper. I'm going to go with like 0.1 and 0.5 seems to be a good value, or we'll go maybe 0.4. Okay. And then for transmission, the UV are kind of, they represent different directions, so kind of width and across, or like parallel and perpendicular, things like that. So the strand, when it renders, will have almost like an anisotropic highlight down the length of it, whereas with transmission, hair tends to be pretty uniformly translucent. Obviously, if it gets thinner, it'll be a little bit more translucent. But with that being said, we're going to keep the roughness at about the same value, and we'll turn that to also 0.1. Okay. So this is a very kind of basic hair shader. Let me do one thing real quick. I'm going to select the body, and I'm going to turn the subsurface modifier off for the time being, or actually I'll just turn it down to 1. I'm trying to speed up the computer a little bit. And let's see if we turn that. No, we'll keep that low. Turn that down to 1. All right. So the next thing that I want to add is I want to add a little bit more color variation to the hair. Right now it's all pretty uniform color. So there's a couple of things that I want to do. The first is just kind of a general noise texture to break it up. So I'm going to hit, actually there's one thing I have to do before that, and that is unwrap the scalp. So this is a really quick unwrap. It doesn't even have to be saved, or at least you don't have to save out a texture. But if I just switch to UV image editor over here, clear out the render result, select my scalp mesh, tab into edit mode. It's already has seams even, which is friggin' wonderful. Although I actually don't even need this center seam. I don't need any of the seams. So I'll just select everything and hit Control E and clear the seams. Actually, I lied. I'm going to keep the seams. Just undo that. But I'll select everything and U and unwrap. And then in the UV image editor, we will average island scale and pack the islands. Oops, I got to select everything first. Average island scale and pack the islands. There. Cool. That works. And that's all I had to do with that, so I can collapse that back down. Now, in my node editor, I can add in a Musgrave texture. What is a Musgrave texture? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me add in a emission shader temporarily, so you can take a look at what that looks like, and I'll put that into the surface output and go to my materials tab and look at a plane. Okay. So this is what a Musgrave texture is. It's like a noise texture, but different. It's just a variation on a noise. So if we add in a input texture coordinate and link up the UVs to the vector and tab into object mode, and actually we'll go into, let's see if I can get away with textured. How does that look? Nope. We have to do rendered. All right. So you can see now how that's being applied to the actual hair. Now if we turn the scale way up, at 63 we're getting that. And you can just kind of keep going up and getting something that feels with, it's got a little bit more variation. So 84, 151. Let's see, what does 120 feel like? Yeah, I like that. Okay, so that's the Musgrave texture. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this to kind of determine a variation. So we've got our Musgrave texture. You can see how it's giving variation to the hair. Now let's actually plug that into realistic values. So I'm going to add a color mix RGB, and I'm going to set my color variations. I will pull this color right here. I'll copy that to the first slot and the second slot, and I'll just make the second slot a little bit darker. Okay, we'll go with that for now. And then I'm going to, instead of, so this will go into the color of each of these, and then I'm going to take the Musgrave texture and I'm going to plug that into the factor. And then we will hook our regular shader back up. Okay, and now you can see the preview, what is actually happening, and you can see even with the hair, how that's being affected. Well, that's the first way to add some variation. There is one additional way. Well, there's more than one additional way, but one more way that I want to cover. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to add input hair info. What we're going to do is we're going to change the color of the strand along the length of it. So from the root to the tip, it can change colors. So Shift A, add converter color ramp. I'm going to pull the intercept into the factor, and we'll set our two colors. So we'll set that to a kind of dark brownish, and we'll set the other one to a lighter orangish and a little bit desaturated. Not that desaturated, maybe something like that. Okay. And then we just have to mix this in. So we're going to add in a color mix RGB. Let's get rid of this emission node. We don't need it anymore. And we will mix the color into the first slot and the output into let's try here. That might not be quite right, but we'll see. No, that is definitely not right. Let me undo that for a second. All right, so I've put the color ramp to black and white. That factor is going into a color mix. So from root to tip, that's the transition that we're getting. And actually, I think I got that backwards. If I zoom in here, if I plug this directly into here, yeah, I think I got it backwards. So you can see that the root is lighter than the tip, so I'm going to switch these. We're going to copy this, paste it there, and then we're going to make this one a little bit lighter and a little bit more desaturated. Okay. We can bring the roots up a little bit more, set that to B-spline. That's better. Okay. So then we're mixing that with our Musgrave texture, and then connect the output of this mix node to the color inputs of our hair. Okay. Cool. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop with this shader. There's a little bit more that I can do, and I will do a little more work and put a more complete version of this shader online. But this is pretty much, there's certainly an acceptable result here. So what I'll do now is go to my camera view, and I'm going to unhide my camera and my camera target. I'm going to move these up to the hair. Zoom my camera in. Move it around. Okay. And make sure my particle settings are where I want them to be. We're rendering 500. Yep. All right. So let's do a render and see what happens. All right. So this is obviously taking a little while to render. With the recording going, it's saying it's going to take another hour and 20 minutes to render. I've got the sample set to 1,000 and a bunch of strands. So I might tweak the render settings a bit. Obviously, the hair needs more work. There's some bald patches. But you get the idea as far as how it's set up, the general shader setup. As with all things in Blender, the more time you take with it and the more detailed you are with it, the better the result. So, give yourself the time to actually play around with it, and give yourself, obviously, the time to render it to get a good result. Even from this preview, I can see that the strands are still probably a little bit too thick. Obviously, there's more grooming stuff to do, but it's a pretty decent result for not a whole hell of a lot of effort. So that's it for this, and next week we will start talking about rigging, actually, and how we're going to do a little bit of animation. Not a bunch, but at least a little bit. So hope this helped, and see you next week.